So if we're making a trim sheet, let me just auto minimize there. If you're making a trim sheet from mesh, I mentioned before that you can sort of export a plane and then export your high poly mesh and try to bake it in X normal. I realized actually that's a very kind of complicated method and can lead to a lot of errors. So I've kind of found a way to make this a lot easier. If you want to export it, basically your mesh from a document, we have a really good way to do this. So first thing is actually resizing your document. So if you take a look, I'm going to zoom out just so you can see the borders of my document. Zbrush's workspace is actually all based on pixels. So whatever's in that document space is essentially your viewport, right? So you can sculpt around. But we can also use it as a way to export flat texture as well, which you may or may not realize. So when you make a new document, it automatically fits the window size, which is the area not taken up by the interface essentially. So I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to turn off proportionate. So if your texture resolution is 2048, you can actually resize the document to this. So I'm going to hit resize. Now it's a little weird because it will leave a screenshot of whatever was left in the canvas. So I usually have to clear the canvas and re-drag out my mesh and then go back into edit mode. And to see the full document, you need to actually use the zoom button. So you're kind of zooming away from the workspace. So I usually like to turn off perspective, rotate to a top view, and hit F. And this should, for the most part, fully frame your object. Now, if you need to, you can always try to reframe as well. So I think I'm going to just zoom in just a bit more. There, that's close enough, I think. Oops. Just going to move this a little bit more. Okay. All right, so careful not to move. So there's a couple of interesting things. You can try this actually. There is a normal map material, which I've overlooked. So you can actually try to render out your objects this way. I think this also has some poly paint on it or texture on it. So you can also turn this off just to get a pure normal map output. So you could, if you were just do a simple export of this, you can actually just go export or export screen grab. Export should work fine. Now my other method though, I'm going to just switch this back to the skin shade and turn poly paint back on, because I think this thing has, like I said, some little bit of like roughness and rough strokes. Under Z plugin we have the Zbrush to Photoshop plugin, which is great. So if you have any kind of paint on your object, you can get flat color through what's known as albedo. We can actually do an ambient occlusion calculation. I may use this at some point, I may not. Color bump is basically just like a grayscale bump map, and depth is going to give you basically like a height map, which would be like a displacement map almost. So what this will do is actually do like a full high detail render when we click on render. If you want to, you can try to add spec maybe for some texture painting. I definitely want the tangent space normal, which is what we would use in Maya for our bump or normal map. Something else you can try as well, you can actually have what's called a subtool mask. So if you still wanted to isolate individual parts to do a custom color paint over, each subtool will basically get auto color coded based on its separate subgroups. So that can make it really, really handy for masked painting as well. So this is really amazing. Again, for my assignment, basically I'm looking at ambient occlusion, color, and the normal map. So but again, I'm just adding a few in case I want them for masking, painting, other effects. And then you're going to click on Send to Photoshop. Chances are the first time you run it, it will not locate Photoshop, so you have to basically click on that warning, go to your D drive, Program Files, Adobe, or if you're on a Mac, it might be in a different location, but you basically need to find the Photoshop EXE or Photoshop shortcut. So I'll select that, and it's now going to start actually doing a render calculation. So you'll see it kind of zip through and run through that calculation. So I'm going to just pause. So Photoshop is automatically launching after it's done its calculations, and you have to say yes to this warning when this pops up. So all your other layers are there. The one thing I've noticed is the ambient occlusion render is kind of weak. So I've come up with another little hack for that, but here we go. Is basically this is our sort of full color render. So this is the basic texture that was painted on, and what's great about this too is like you can decide, you know what, you're going to take that render. There's no masking, by the way, so I'm going to just delete the groups and the layers that I don't have or aren't using. So there's our ambient layer, and let me just set this to normal. This one actually turned out okay. So if you just had the ambient occlusion, you could always kind of paint in layers of color underneath this. I did generate a spec map, which is basically like a reflection map, and again, I'll just set it to normal so we can see the full map. So sometimes you can kind of blend these things together to make a custom color, or if we're just putting a new layer underneath, let me just fill with white, and then we can set this to multiply. So as a kind of paint effect, if you're not painting in ZBrush, oops. Sorry, let's get into brush mode. Right, so you can kind of brush in areas if you want. And what's great about this too is I believe we should have an ID map. I don't know if it output or not, but yeah, maybe not. Yeah, so you can also just go in by selection as well. And a lot of times what I'll do is, let's say we just fill this with like a gray blue. Let's do Shift F5. So I'll pick a color. We'll do kind of like a sort of metallic blue type gray. What's great about this is even just having the ambient occlusion, you can actually hit Control U, which is basically hue saturation, and you can decide to colorize this so you can give it kind of like a different type of effect. So sometimes I'll take certain section to colorize and lay in secondary color. Instead of just like a basic you know, kind of gray on color blend, this can actually give you some really, really interesting sort of results and almost like a fake fill color effect. And you know, you can also duplicate this layer, preserve it, so you always have the black and white version. And of course, like I said, you could lay on top texture, metal texture. I believe this thing already had some ZBrush colors. So let me just turn off the effects group for a sec. So yeah, we could take something like this, you know, some sculpting bump layers, and so then I'll maybe switch this to a multiply or mess around with some other blending modes. Anyway, so lots of really interesting options to kind of get, you know, different text and color effects. So this is the depth mask, by the way. So it's showing things at different depths. So things that are further away are black. Things that are closer to the surface are white. And so that can actually be used as a displacement. And our normal map, like I said, it turned out pretty great. Totally usable inside of Maya or any other 3D software. So these other ones, like I said, I don't have any layers for that. And then this is our base albedo. So this was the base color paint that was painted on the surface. So you will get that kind of nice flat neutral color without the shading, highlight effects. So this is a really, really great way, like I said, to get a quick output of your normal maps and stuff.